So welcome everybody. Again, thank you for being here. We have a really exciting meeting scheduled for you today, but I wanted to take a second and remind you guys what we do. So I'm actually going to flip over to our workplace group so I can read you exactly what we're about. So this is our description. If you haven't subscribed to our page on Workplace, please do. It's simply called the eXp Industrial Committee Live. This is where you'll get most of the notifications about what we're doing, what we're up to, how to reach out to us for support. So here's what we are. Welcome to the eXp Commercial Industrial Committee. Our committee is dedicated to bringing together brokers, investors, and industry leaders to share the latest national trends and best practices in the world of industrial real estate. We lead bi-monthly meetings. We need to update that, Jabin. It says monthly meetings. We lead bi-monthly meetings where members can share summaries of deals, discuss upcoming events, and connect with others in the industry. We encourage collaboration among our members, including agent attraction and events, as well as suggestions for topics related to education and trainings. By sharing knowledge and collaborating with one another, we will continue to grow and achieving as industry professionals. In addition, we provide valuable insights to upcoming events and speakers that are specific to the industrial product type. These events and speakers provide our members with access to information that aids in maintaining competitive edge in the market, helping them stay in the forefront of the evolving industry we operate in. To ensure productive and effective meetings, we ask that members submit a one-page summary of their deal prior to the meeting and speak on it as an overview, not a long pitch. Join our community today and stay up to touch with the latest trends and developments in the world of industrial real estate, and we look forward to connecting with you. So right now we've got 91 members strong. We just want to remind you that we are here as a resource for you guys, so please reach out to us. And that deal share page that I was referring to in our summary is actually pinned to the top of our workplace group. So that's where you can find that if you ever want to share a deal on one of these lives. So with that being said, I'm going to swing you over to Jabin because we have a really exciting morning planned for you.
Thank you so much, Pam. Guys, welcome again. We are really excited to have a guest speaker today, Matt Winefield. He's an engineer and businessman who has been supporting the redevelopment of contaminated properties since 1989. And so I would love, Matt, if you could just introduce yourself, kind of go through your story, and talk a little bit about what you do, what you specialize in, and then we can jump into your presentation, guys, and then we're going to ask some questions and then end it off with Q&A. And Pam and I are really excited about this. I think it's going to be a very informative session. So, Matt, take it away.
Thank you. It's wonderful to meet you all here at eXp. As Jabin mentioned, my background is environmental engineering, but I've been involved in property transfers for 30 plus years. I started off doing remediation for Chevron, and then I worked for another oil company. And then for 16 years, I had my own engineering firm where we were doing remediation and assessment for developers who were transferring commercial industrial properties.
Rachel, can you mute your mic?
There she is. I'm going to mute her. I got it.
Oh.
We're good. I couldn't find it.
Okay. So I work about half of my, now I'm buying properties with contamination. So think of a strip mall that's had a leaky dry cleaner or a gas station corner or a warehouse or an aerospace facility. We love warehouses. I just bought a warehouse 3 weeks ago. So I buy, and a lot of my interactions are with brokers. I get my referrals from brokers, environmental attorneys, real estate attorneys, and I look at about 200 transactions a year. Just one a working day comes through my email, and I'm looking at data. I'm based in LA, Long Beach, Orange County, Southern California. I'm in Chicago today, visiting family, so that's the business model. And I would say about a third of my time is spent helping brokers when they've run into problems. Say you're an escrow with warehouse X and location Y, and they've done their phase 1 environmental site assessment, and there's a recognized environmental condition. Sometimes the deals die, but the intent of the 15 minutes or so I'm going to be speaking, maybe 20, is to help you understand how those deals don't need to die if they've had a bad phase 1 or phase 2 environmental assessment. So if that's the background, I can share a screen if you think it's appropriate, Jabin, and just run through some PowerPoints.
Absolutely, that'd be great. And I believe Pam already gave you sharing privileges, so
Okay.
you should be good to go.
Well, I'm not technically savvy, but I think I got this.
Hey, we've got tech support if you need it.
Okay. Well, for some reason, I am not. There we go. There we
Perfect.
go. Okay, and then I'm going to reduce. Okay, so and move bar. Great. Oh my gosh, everything's working. It's a good start. So as the title notes, we're going to save property transactions when you've got recognized environmental conditions. I'm assuming, unless someone stops me, that everyone knows what phase one environmental site assessment is. Am I correct there?
Let's go ahead and just give a quick 15-minute
Sure.
summary on what that is. Yeah.
Sure. So a phase one environmental site assessment is a database review that has to be done on an industrial property before you do a transaction. So the broker or the buyer or the seller will hire an environmental consultant who look at environmental regulatory databases. He'll contact the agencies. He'll do a site visit. He'll look at what kind of operations have been there. He'll look to see, the consultant will look to see if there's been any records of release or agency oversight. And for example, the most common scenario would be if someone's buying a strip mall, there's a dry cleaner, the dry cleaner had a release, and they're looking at soil and groundwater, and maybe the transaction stops in its tracks. So, okay, I am not able to tab down. I apologize. Let's see. Well, that's not good. I'm so sorry. My screen is frozen and I'm not able to go to the next slide. Well, that is a pickle.
So even with the arrows too, like
yeah, I'm arrowing down here. Okay, let me.
Take your time and restart it.
There we go.
Hey.
No. I just did it through the screen. So we're going to talk about some of the areas we target. Environmental remediation 101, just basics of how sites are cleaned up, how we price sites that have environmental challenges, a couple sample projects, and obviously we'll have time for questions. In California, we estimate that there are about 200,000 sites that need some sort of environmental work. So if you're a commercial industrial broker, you're going to run into a phase one that gives you results you're not going to like. And then in terms of the types of projects Winefield Associates likes to buy, the larger picture on the left, infill locations that have value, but for the environmental challenges. If we're in some sort of rustic area with a small gas station where there's not really any land value, we're not going to look at it. We look at gas stations, dry cleaners, heavy industry, and I'm assuming this is within your wheelhouse as well. So just for kicks, we're going to get a little engineering geeky. What this is you'll see a site looking from up top, and the red area, the red dashed lines is about a just a 16,000 square foot parcel I bought that used to be a gas station. And it's, for those of you familiar with Los Angeles, it's right off Sunset and Western, a major intersection, high property values. So we bought it for $1 million, and knowing that there were environmental problems, clean value is about $4 million. So there's a nice big spread there. But when you look on top,
I want to interrupt you, Matt. Guys, bought the property for $1 million. The remediation costs, right, Matt? Is that what you're saying? It costs $4 million to remediate.
No, thank you for stopping me.
Because that's what. Okay, perfect.
When I bought the site, it was 50-50. Me and a real estate attorney bought it. We bought it for $1 million. We felt that if we cleaned it up, we could flip it for $4 million.
Flip it for $4. Got it.
Now, been in the business 30 years. I thought, oh, this is an $800,000 cleanup. Turned out to be a lot more, which happens a lot in environmental, even for the seasoned professional. So you see all these dots here, and those are actually groundwater wells that have been installed. And you see the sort of ovular lines, those are contours of contamination in the groundwater. And flipping ahead here, what we had to do, and this is very typical at these sites, is install a soil vapor extraction system. And you'll see on the left, it's injecting air into the system. And you'll see in the middle, SVE well, soil vapor extraction well, where the vapors from the gasoline release are actually sucked into a treatment system. Now, these kind of systems can cost, for a gas station, anywhere from $300,000 to $3 million when you include all the groundwater monitoring and assessment and wells. So there's a big spread on what the cost could be. And speaking of cost, let's talk about cost reduction. Everyone asks me, Matt, you've got a site that's got a clean value on the top, anywhere ranging from $1 to $10 million. How do you know what to discount the price to account for the environmental remediation? So we've got all sorts of data that we use from our histories, but rule of thumb out here on the West Coast, especially in California, is that a gas station is going to cost you about $1 million to clean up, and then a dry cleaner is going to cost you $1.5 to $2 million. So that's real money. And so you don't know until you start getting soil data, groundwater data, and taking things to the lab and mapping out the contaminants, like I saw you in a couple slides back. So this is just a qualitative table that I show brokers on how sites value gets reduced. So let's look at the 5 million clean value site. And if it's just soil with hydrocarbons in there, well, that's probably a 15% cost reduction. Going all the way down, if you've got groundwater with hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents, you're almost reducing the cost 50% for a $5 million site. And then you see on the $1 million column that if you've got soil with hydrocarbons, that's about a 50% reduction. But if you start introducing more contaminants and more media that is soil and groundwater contaminated with hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents like PCE, then you're just going to have to walk away. So it's clean value of the site, how many contaminants you've got, and whether groundwater or just soil have been impacted. And there's people, hydrogeologists, geologists, scientists that just study how to reduce the cost or what it's going to cost to clean things up. So,
Matt, if I could ask one question, if you
of
could go
course,
back to that slide.
Yes.
I'm curious about the two columns that say nope.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That means we're walking away.
So that's your investment strategy. If it's
well, so what's the adage? I never lost money on a deal I didn't do. So we in the environmental or brownfields business, brownfields, a site that's been impacted with environmental contaminants and is underutilized. We in the remediation brownfields investment business need to know when to say no. And we say no a lot more often than we say yes, because of the risks, because of the liability and potential third-party claims you could have when you buy a site with toxins. So what I know right today, so far in these 8 or 9 slides, I've talked about environmental and technical nuances, but this is really more of a finance play, buying these environmental sites. And so we depend on the very fancy term OPM, other people's money, whether there's going to be a grant program like the State Water Resource Control Board Underground Storage Tank Fund, which a lot of states have. When you fill your tank with gas or diesel, as much as 2 cents may go to a state fund to provide grants for these cleanups. I put AIG, the big insurer, because there are also some old insurance policies, I kid you not, from 1986 and prior, that didn't have pollution exclusions. So we've bought sites, we found some old policies, we've tendered claims to say, listen, you guys issued a general liability policy and that didn't exclude cleanup. They had waste releases in the 80s, pay for the cleanup. And then this silly cartoon, just deep pockets that have maybe been on title that we may sue and claw them back and say, hey, you left some toxins behind, you're joint and severally liable, pay up for the remediation. So it's really just as much a finance play as it is a technical play, looking for grants, insurance, and people who are on title that may have left some contaminants behind. And then I'm always asked, how much do you expect to make in return for these risks you're taking, Winefield? And, we've got to do better than T-bills, NASDAQ, and our investors, we form small syndications, are expecting a 20% annualized rate of return. So I know in the brokerage community, you put something on the market and say, here's the offer, here's what we're requesting as a sales price, based maybe on a 6 cap. Well, we're 3 times that because of the risk involved. So that is a question I get often. So I just wanted to make sure I let people know that when we look at a site that's contaminated, while we're a source of funds to buy that property and take the liability off your client's hands, the return is pretty substantial. It has to be. Couple quick examples of why you don't need to walk away from contaminated sites. In Garden Grove, California, here is an industrial warehouse in the red rectangle on the right side underneath the value $2 million. And this was in a trust. A wealthy family said, we don't want to deal with the contamination issues anymore. We've already spent $600,000. I and my team looked at the warehouse and said, well, there's probably another $1.7 million in remediation. The value of the warehouse was only $2 million. So you ask yourself, why would you take part in that? And the quick answer was, we found some old insurance policies that are now paying for the cleanup. So we bought the site for low 6 figures, and AIG's cleaning it up, and we're getting a tenant renting there about $11,000 a month, triple net. And so that project was actually profiled in the New York Times. So if you want to get on my website, Winefield Inc., you can read more about it. I don't want to delve into a bunch of details other than to say we did a good job saving the project. Here's another. Remember I showed you the graphic at the beginning? This is the actual photo of the gas station. A retired teacher had this in his family. He sold it to us for $1 million. We had speculated we could sell for $4 million. We got money from the Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund grant from the state of California. And then we ended up selling to a multifamily developer. And again, if you want to read more, we were on the cover of LA Business Journal, and this site was profiled there. I'm on the right, my business partner's on the left. My mother to this day, 7 years, says, Matt, why do you look so angry? But so it was just sun in my eyes. So, and we also buy purchase notes. There used to be a much bigger, the note business used to be a lot bigger. It's not as prevalent now, but for those of you who watch Jesse James' Garage, we bought the note for one of his shops in Southern California because it had environmental issues and the bank didn't want to take title to that. So I'm happy to answer questions. I want to make sure to go through this quickly. And let's see if I can stop sharing and we can just see your lovely faces again. There we go. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt. That was super informative. I know I've got some questions. Guys, feel free to jump in whenever. And I'm just going to start naming off some that come to mind. And Pam, Frankie, you guys jump in as well. One I have is, so how can a broker know as soon as possible that there's going to be environmental liability on the site? Is there a way to kind of get an idea of that prior to having to order a phase 1? Or is that really step 1 and you got to start there?
Well, to be safe, you should do the phase 1, but
absolutely,
there are some telltale signs that you've got a problem. One, you just ask the seller if they've got any environmental agency oversight. Then you've got a problem. And you can also keep in mind that 90% of dry cleaners are going to have a problem. Literally that much have had a release of a very dangerous chemical called PCE. And then if there's a plating shop. So who here brokers heavy industry? Does everybody broker heavy industry sites on this Zoom? For the most part? Okay.
For the most part.
So plating shops, they're going to have a release. They will have had a release. There's some of the worst actors out there. Dry cleaners and service stations. So and then another thing to do is just develop a relationship with an environmental consultant in your area and say, I've got this kind of facility, Mr. Consultant. what do you think the odds are it's had a release, or it's going to have an environmental problem, or it's going to thwart our deal? So,
So Matt, how hard is it when you start dealing with environmental issues to get conventional lending with a bank? How often do they lend on properties like this, or is it pretty much creative finance or cash or private capital? Do you see lenders lending on properties with environmental issues?
Not very often, and if they do, they have to be pretty open-minded, and the remediation issues have to be pretty far along in the process. For instance, if you've just found that you've had a release into soil and groundwater and it hasn't been delineated, no conventional bank is going to provide you debt. But if that same site is 3 years down the road and they've mapped it all out and they put in a system and they're taking out the contaminants and everyone agrees it's got a year or two to go and they can put a budget on it. So what I've seen some of the more open-minded conventional lenders do is say, all right, we need a reserve of 1.5 times the expected remediation cost, maybe in a fund, and maybe they'll do it. And we've managed to develop relationships with debt providers because we're in the business. So I think we get just a little extra attention and consideration.
Right.
But it's usually equity. And then another, when in doubt, ask for seller-backed financing. And sometimes if they've been out to market for a couple of years and no one's been able to get debt, the seller will concede to financing the deal.
So,
I love, or go ahead, Pam.
I was just going to say, we do have a question in the audience, patiently waiting with a hand up. Vu,
oh, yes.
Want to unmute yourself?
Thank you for joining us, Matt. I had a question about do you, as a company, assist investors through the remediation process and going through that strategy, or are you more interested in just purchasing the property to be able to potentially like flip it?
Much more so investing. However, what I sometimes do is I will find a site, and if it doesn't work for our group, I will find another investor and we will advise them through due diligence. And we specifically don't want to compete with environmental consultants because they provide us referrals. And we're also not brokers. We don't want to compete with brokers. We want the brokers to get their full commission. However, I will sometimes advise investors through due diligence, line them up with a great environmental attorney, great consultant. Maybe there's some insurance they can buy for the facility. And then if they close, they give us a consulting fee at closing. But we want to be very careful not to compete with the environmental consultants in this line of work.
Got it. Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Matt, I would love to hear a disaster story. So, you've shared some success stories on, those are always great, but we also learn, from failure. I think it would be a great opportunity to share one of your worst disaster stories that you can think of with everybody.
I've got some disaster stories, and I'm going to tell a disaster story that's in the public record. So if you go to my website, Winefield Inc., you're going to see on the latest, blog, the Sacramento Bee published a 3-part set of stories having to do with dry cleaner releases. And there's this poor lady who took over her father's dry cleaner after he had passed. And for 10 years, she has been trying to remediate it. And she has spent $2-3 million and it's still not cleaned up. And the California EPA just changed the goalpost. So she did everything right for 10 years. Thank you, Javen, for sharing that. And
absolutely.
And she's still cleaning it up, and she cannot get a no further action letter so she can sell her piece of land to multifamily developers. So I will dovetail into that response by saying one way your clients can protect themselves is if they find a site and they do a phase 1 environmental assessment, and the consultant who's trying to make their money say, okay, it's time to do a phase 2 and spend real money. Maybe say, stop, call an environmental insurance broker and see if you've got enough data to buy a 10-year pollution legal liability policy. And that provides a fair amount of protection. But once you drill, you cannot insure a burning building. So one way to avoid disasters is looking into environmental insurance. And there's two types of environmental insurance I've talked about. I've talked about the kind you buy now and the kind of general liability policies that didn't exclude pollution. Sorry if I'm getting in the weeds too much.
No, this is great.
Get in the weeds. I have a question for you. So from the brokerage standpoint, we've got a client that's getting poised to make an offer on a property, and we have a suspicion there could be some environmental issues. What type of timeframes should an agent or a broker be looking at as far as due diligence is concerned to best protect themselves contractually?
So due diligence for environmental matters can vary substantially. So I always say the less data that's available, the lower the offer price is going to be, because the buyer doesn't really know. So, but if you're about to get into PSA and you've got an eager buyer and an eager seller, I would not do less than 60 days of due diligence to allow yourself one round of environmental assessment. So that is sort of a guiding light. However, but if you want to have a sort of a joint venture, so to speak, between seller and buyer, where they say, okay, we're not going to commit to closing this deal until we have a plan of action with the regulators, you might need a year. So much depends on how far along. Well, I think you said you're not quite certain whether it's contaminated or not. So if you're just starting with a phase 1 stage, then give yourself 60 days. Phase 1, phase 2 can be done in that area, and then see where you're at. But allow yourself some extension language so the deal doesn't die just because they didn't meet their criteria. So 60 days.
Great advice. I love it. Anyone else out there have any questions?
Jabin, a little advice. If you go meet your seller and you see a pile of letters from the DTSC on their desk, that's kind of fun.
Yeah, that one's pretty rough.
No, I think,
DTSC. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Well, yeah, I'm sure you've had plenty of fun with them, and I have too, especially in the Gardena area. There was a deal. Remember Westlock, that whole site there? That was super fun.
I don't.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's a super fun site. So super fun sites, for those of you who aren't aware, are huge $10-100 million plus remediation projects that the government has taken over because private parties have sort of walked away.
Yeah. They were a competitor to Quickset, and they, there was a plating operation, and they had a clarifier and a pit that you could drive a Greyhound bus into of sulfuric acid and all kinds of fun stuff. And the groundwater was just shot. I think they had to dig into the site probably 30-40 feet down, and clean it up. But, and that's just something that was crazy. I think a firm bought it because there was some, liability issues that they could, in a way, purchase cheap and then go after them. Because there was someone that was a big, Fortune 100 company that was on the hook for it. So I think that's the opportunity they saw. But as far as most of the environmental concerns and ideas, I think in my experience, most of the phase 1s, phase 2s, leases, and whatever varying types of reports have been probably 80% ordered by banks, especially if the property is being financed initially. They're the ones that have the most liability, and they're the ones that want the phase 1 and onwards. And so I think a lot of brokers in a transaction are probably, the bank is requiring that to get an environmental kind of a questionnaire done and get an ID. But I think us as brokers, we'll get an idea of what's going on when we visit the property. There's drums in the corner, what do they do? Is there any USTs around or any history of it? So, yeah, it's pretty much being nosy. You'll see it, I think.
But Charles brings up a good point. You just have to ask the seller, to be candid about whether they've got agency action. And Charles mentions the Department of Toxic Substance Control letters on people's death that are being ignored. I've had people ignore the Water Board, DTSC, the health agencies for 5, 10, 15 years. And they don't care. Now, that's not the way to run a business, but it happens. And then so when the transaction happens and there's maybe some sort of agency notification, like, someone who's going to pay attention, let's really rifle down and get the new buyer to do something. So yeah, that can be scary. And I've got another scary story. I was looking at a plating shop to acquire it, and it was there was an operator, and then there was the owner. So I just was walking in front. So I'm driving the Cubs Dodgers game. I want to check out this site on the way. So I go there, and the operator comes out and goes, "Are you the guy that's thinking of buying this property?" It's like, oh darn, yeah, that's me. Come in, I want to tell you about it. And so we sit down, and the first thing he says is, I'm sure you've heard I've gone to jail for disposing waste improperly, right? So that is a sure sign there's problems. And we didn't do the deal, obviously.
Wow. So Matt, what type of resources are out there for, finding these grants? Or is there a website that brokers can go to find different grants? There was one. I had a similar scenario. I don't remember the name of the fund, but where they completely they took care of all the costs of remediation for my client because of some previous funds that were allocated for certain areas or certain properties. Where is there a certain place that you go? A website? Yeah.
I wish there was one place, but it varies so much by state, and the EPA has their programs. God bless them, but they don't provide a lot of money nationwide. So I would turn to a nonprofit that is fantastic, and the acronym is CCLR, which stands for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. And they're a nonprofit that helps cities and investors find grants and low interest loans for cleanups, and they're phenomenal, and they're nationwide. So that is a good resource. And then it's just Googling, where you're at. Let's see, Chattanooga, Tennessee, like Lou is, say Chattanooga environmental grants, and sometimes you'll run into consultants or government information that can provide you. And so also the good environmental consultants have an expert in grant writing, because it helps them get business. When I owned my environmental firm, we had 2 people who just did grants and digging for old insurance policies, and it got us a lot of business. So there you go, your consultant and Center and CCLR.
So I have a question about that. How are you digging for old insurance policies?
Well, it's not sexy, but if you find, for instance, a 1980 insurance policy that does not have a pollution exclusion, you get the amount of the coverage. Say it's only $500,000, but you also get defense, which doesn't have a cap. So that $500,000 can actually be a couple million. So what you do is you hire people that specialize, and they call themselves insurance archaeologists. Sexy name for making a lot of calls. And what they do is they know areas of the country where certain brokers specialize in certain industries, and they know which insurance companies in what period provided insurance for certain industries. And they tend to go into people's garages and look at old financial data. So however, if you send a request to a carrier, they're always going to say, we don't have a policy for that site, because I think their requirement to dig is pretty nominal. So you hire insurance archaeologists. Some environmental law firms can help you with that too. I do want to warn, it can get expensive. It's probably a $15,000 research project, but if you've got 6-7 figures of potential environmental liability, it's worth looking into it. So yeah, insurance archaeologists, law firms, and then some consultants will have environmental consultants.
Definitely sounds like the ROI is there if you've got the cash to lay out. And
Yes.
speaking of insurance, that's all the buzz in the industry right now too. Insurance has changed exponentially. There's a lot of hardships going on with
Yeah.
insurance right now. Are you experiencing anything of late, getting your projects insured?
For general real estate and liability, yes. In fact, that warehouse I just bought, I bought without insurance. Also, yeah, believe it or not, because we got such a deal on it, we literally said, if it goes up in flames, we'll be okay. God forbid. But we did get liability insurance from the tenant. So it's very difficult. And because the place needs a new roof and new electrical, we were not able to get property insurance for it. But that's the risk we're taking until those repairs are done, and we're trying to get the tenant to take on those repairs. But yeah, but on the pollution, legal, liability, environmental insurance, nothing has changed dramatically there. And so we will sometimes buy that if there's been no phase 2 and we want 10 years of coverage in case an agency official knocks on our door. The drawback to those policies is they don't work if you have development, because if you have development project, you are going to have to make agency notification and dig up dirty dirt possible. And so they're not going to provide you a policy knowing next year you're going to have to make notification. And I think Terry has a question.
Go for it, Terry.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I was wondering, how effective are the vapor studies as opposed to like the core sampling on a determined issue?
Good question. So I'm going to give a little background. There's a couple ways to find contaminants in soil. One is to core, take the soil sample, put it through a gas chromatogram, and see what the concentrations mass are in the soil. And you'll get a result like per milligram per kilogram. Now there's another way to do it where you actually stick a tube, typically right beneath the concrete or asphalt, to then 5 and 10 and 15 feet beneath it, and you suck vapors for a set amount of time, set volume, and you quantify the mass in the vapors. So Terry was asking which is more accurate, which is more commonplace, and right now what's used more are the vapor studies because it's much more sensitive. And while the soil matrix analyses are important to see where the source of the release is, from a human health standpoint, the agencies are relying much more on these vapor studies. And I hate to keep on bringing up California, but I do about 80% of my work here. And I'll say that in the past 3 years, the agencies have reduced their action limit concentration about 95%. It used to be able to close a site with PCE at 2,000 micrograms per cubic meter. Now it's 67 for commercial industrial. So that's a big reduction. So Terry, it's all about vapor surveys, vapor studies, and indoor air vapor testing, which obviously is important as well.
Okay.
Hope that answers.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Who else has questions? We've got about we're up at 10:40 here, so I want to open it up to more Q&A for you guys. What other questions do we have?
I'll ask you one thing, Matt. Are there any other areas, because you are hypersensitive to California, are there any other areas that might be ripe for this type of investigation for opportunities that you're aware of?
I would say, I can't really speak to all areas, but infill areas that you've known have had have had commercial industrial operations for quite some time. So, and then think of valuable infill areas, because we can't look at a site that has a clean value of less than 2 million at the absolute bottom because of the cost of environmental liability. So, and any infill area, and I mean, we've done work in Florida, Arizona, Washington State, Illinois, New York, New Jersey. So just valuable infill areas that have a good per square foot valuation. again, out in the exurbs where land value is low, it's probably not going to be a great investment unless it's a huge piece of land and you've got someone who's really eager to develop there. If anybody has a city of interest, I'm happy to address it.
Well, I'm from a small town outside of Pittsburgh. So we've got the Ohio River, the three rivers that connect. You've got the railroad system that's been there for ages and ages, since before I was a kid. And then you had J&L Steel Mill right next to the rivers. You had Shipping Port, which is a
major project.
What did they?
Let me address that. A project of that magnitude is so large that if there is a huge development plan, say upwards of $100 million worth of work, the environmental issue may not have a huge bearing. And I know that sounds strange. I mean, because there is a development driving force, if there's a $5 million remediation project, that deal will still happen. The big problems are when you've got a $10 million clean value and a $5 million remediation project. So that proportion of clean value to remediation costs looms large. So I always tell people, I'm not going to compete with Rexford Industrial as a huge multi-billion-dollar industrial firm. I'm not going to compete with Turner Construction's development arm or CBRE's development arm. They will find a way to get those big projects going because there's so much delta difference between what the profit is and what the remediation costs are. And
Matt,
I think yes.
Or sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask you, so as an investor, right, when you're putting these deals together and negotiating with sellers, are you, what's your approach? Is it, do you approach it on the front end and just try to get it as low as possible up front and explain everything up front? Or do you see yourself having to retrade once you get into due diligence, when you realize that costs have fluctuated from what you estimated it would be? What's your approach with handling those conversations and getting sellers to realize, where you need to be to make it happen and that you're the best guy for the job if somebody's going to buy it?
Well, in terms of best guy for the job, I'll ask them to look at the portfolio on the website, and I'll, tell them about the deals we've closed. And then in terms of pricing, we're very upfront. There's no magic here. We say there's going to be a remediation estimate that we're going to put together, and we're going to multiply that by 1.5. And then we're going to do a cash flow analysis, and we're going to need a 12 cap. Now, I said 20 earlier, but 12 cap can get us going. And when you crunch that number out right away, that's usually a pretty big difference between what the seller thought he was getting. First of all, the seller won't believe you when you tell them that his dry cleaner site's going to take this strip mall with a dry cleaner. Say the strip mall is worth $12 million total, and that little bitty dry cleaner is creating $1.5 million problem. They don't believe me. And so, and I think I see Charles nodding his head in the affirmative. And so, as long as we're upfront telling them that we need to get paid for our risk, everything turns out all right. What happens a lot is they walk away, and I say, I'm available for questions if you've got them later on. We don't need to do a deal for me to try to help you out. And then I'll hear from them 6 to 9 months later when they've heard it elsewhere. And I'm involved in 3 transactions. Right now, we're within a year, within the past year, they said, no, thank you. And then they came back.
Hey, provide the value up front. They'll come back.
Yeah, and just, it's just the old adage, just be upfront, tell them what you're thinking, don't hide. And everyone hates retrades. And we try not to do it. I'd say 90% of the time we don't have to. We've got a little factor of safety at the onset. But another thing go ahead. Sorry. No. I've had too much coffee, please.
Well, Jenny had a question. She asked, would you want this for an auto shop? I would say absolutely. What's your opinion on that?
Definitely need a phase 1. Auto shops, usually, depending on the kind of auto shop, if they're family run or a chain, if they're family run, then they might not have had some of the preventative measures that, you know, a nice big chain would have. But auto shops can be risky, but sometimes they're not as risky as dry cleaner. They're not as risky as plating shops. Sometimes they've just had, see if they've had an underground storage tank. And if they're an auto shop that didn't have an underground storage tank, you might be all right. And another tidbit is when they clean engine in an auto shop, they dilute the PCE and TCE, whereas a lot of plating shops and dry cleaners do not. So auto shops, phase one, it'll say you have a recognized environmental condition, then they'll ask for a phase two, and then you have to decide whether you want to do a phase two or get an insurance policy and what the bank wants. But auto shops definitely have a recognized environmental condition. But on the hierarchy of risks, I'd call them a 3 out of 10, plating shops being 10.
It's
Hope
interesting.
that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I love that. And along that vein, I'm not sure if anyone else experienced this in your region. However, in Las Vegas, I can tell you there was a huge trend as industrial just started to ramp up, and our vacancy factor got, you know, between 3% and 0% at any given time. When leases were coming due for renewal with auto shops in it, landlords were giving them 30-day notice, telling them to hit the road because the demand was so intense for warehouse and industrial space. They no longer had to lease to auto. So even though it might be a 3 out of 10, there was a period when landlords were just not willing to take that small risk, even because they just simply didn't have to. The demand was so high.
Interesting.
I'm not sure if anyone else experienced that in your region. We are seeing a little bit more come on the market now because it's loosened up just a little bit, but it's still, the demand for industrial real estate is still historically high in our region.
Yeah, Pam, if I may add, I know a lot of it has to do with, you know, some of these users, what they're spraying into the air besides what's going into the ground. You get AQMD and stuff, and a lot of the pullback on the materials coming out of, like, let's say, paint. You know, you've got a lot of low VOC or volatile organic compound level that has to be almost zero. They've all gone to water-based, but for a while there were a lot of places that were going to Las Vegas or to Nevada because they could do what they couldn't do in California, right? I think that's probably changed now, you know, but there was, for a while, it was like, well, we can't even mix the paint here, you know, or let alone sell it. So they were going to other states to distribute it out. But yeah,
we got a lot of them. We got a lot of them.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, but it had a lot to do with what was actually being sprayed out. I mean, you had auto shops, you know, spraying and cleaning with trichloroethane and stuff. It was just all going out in the, you know, in the parking lot sometimes, you know. But I think, Jabin, to your story, as far as auto shops, we always look at, you know, does it have a hydraulic lift? And that's the number one bad boy. Or if they've got a clarifier, you know, a little thing in the ground where they can clean off. So if they have those two, I mean, you're going to have to do some sort of investigation. But it's the bank that's probably more worried about it than the buyer, you know, because if they're financing, you know, an SBA, 90% of it, they're holding the bag. So they're going to be the ones determining what kind of environmental scope, you know, more or less.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's also, you know, and that for everybody listening, you know, oftentimes owners that have these automotive shops, I've noticed just in my experience, a lot of them, to your point, Matt, on the pendulum of seriousness of environmental risk, automotive shops are relatively lower on that pendulum. What's interesting is a lot of times these sellers may not necessarily know that. And so, you know, they hear just in their town, you know, environmental, they think it's a big problem. Maybe it's not. And that's, you know, for people out there trying to get deals done, that's potentially an opportunity to, you know, engage these people. Maybe there's some unrealized value that needs to be explored. And I think that's something to make note of, because a lot of people think automotive shops as risky, very, very high on the environmental spectrum locally. So.
And if I could interject, Jabin, as a master broker for Caliber Collision, I would clarify and say it's really car service centers that are the problematic user, because they're the ones changing the oil, changing the fluids, and that causes potential remediation to occur. The body shops, they're really just changing the body of the car and painting, and these paint booths are pretty strong standards as it comes to EPA and contained. And to that effect, I would say these national users also don't want to be in a dirty property at all. To Charles' point, I completely agree. It's usually financing that drives the boat when we may look at a property that has some environmental difficulties and hardship, but it's certainly also the tenant that absolutely does not want to get into any form of dirty problem. Funny enough, to Matt's exact point, I did a caliber collision in Lafayette, Indiana, a warehouse that was a owner's kind of facility for their dry cleaning chemicals. And to that exact point, that property had a lot of problems, and no one would go through with that until remediation was completely clarified. So auto service centers are certainly the difficulties. Same with the car washes. I mean, there's a lot of car washes on the market that are self-service or just kind of single tunnel, and those boys have some issues too, and they sit. So auto service center challenging, auto body not as much, because the chemicals are certainly not as exposed because they're not changing the chemicals.
Thanks for the differentiation.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I love that, Spencer, because we are seeing these paint booths now that are pretty fantastic.
Yes.
Like the level, the degree that the city and the county makes them build these paint booths is nothing's getting out of there.
No.
Well, and they're all using now, mainly water-based stuff. So what they're spraying is not as bad as it used to be. So that's a big driving factor too.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if we have any other hands up real quick. So the only other thing that I kind of wanted to like discuss as a group here, broker to broker, is, I think we've talked a lot about education, right? Education is key. Be as transparent as possible. Matt, I love that you say that, right? You go into a transaction. What do you know about this property? What do you have on this property? I also think that as a broker, if you're going to list a property that could possibly have some contaminants or be perceived as having some contaminants, it's always a good idea to, have the seller do some of that due diligence up front, right? Because in my opinion, if you can mitigate the unknowing from the buyer's side, you have a very good chance at getting that seller a lot highest and best money for that property, right? A lot better value. Don't make them do so much work, right? Do the investigation, get your phase one done, get all of your questionnaires and disclosures answered, address any issues that you might have before you get to the market, so that it's not some big question mark when you're out there. You're probably going to be doing your seller and yourself a real service by doing that, in my humble opinion.
Pam, if I can respond to that. Oh, sorry about that.
Go right ahead. After you.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so going along with that, wouldn't you want the financing to kind of, as you said, drive the boat with that and allow the buyers to, and whoever they're working with for their financing to help give that direction instead of having to pay so much of those funds up front from your seller? Or is it automatic that obviously do the phase one, because everyone's going to have a phase one on that property?
I think
when I look at a site, I like to see a phase one already. It helps just to have that 3-page executive summary to know where I'm at. And it is 2,500, 3,000, but I think it's good to have for the seller so they know what their baseline is at. And I know the banks will ask for a new one every 6 months, but it's just good data. And then I don't want to give a broker tip. If you're involved in a site that you know is going to get a major cost reduction because of environmental, I mean, I've bought sites for $100,000, and that's not much of a brokerage fee, is have an agreement with your seller that if there is going to be a major reduction, that's not going to impact your broker's fee. And that your broker's fee should be based on the appraised clean value. Because if you're helping them sell dirty dirt and you're helping them get rid of liability, you should be remunerated for that. So I've seen some brokers get sort of turned around, but if you can do it, have the broker fee based on the appraised clean value, because you're providing a service if you're selling a contaminated site.
I love that advice, and
it's a new way to look at it.
And I now have new vernacular, dirty dirt. I'm using that one.
What happened? You sell dirty dirt. I like that too. This has been fantastic.
I appreciate everyone's questions.
Well, does anyone else have questions before we wrap up?
Let's see. I don't see any hands up, Jabin, and I see nothing in the chat.
Right on time, 10:57.
Or
Matt, thank you.
7:57.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, 7:57. We're gonna change it next year to make it work for everybody. Matt, this has been amazing. We will share your information in Workplace as well with the committee. Definitely an incredible resource, and glad to hear that you're doing deals all over the country. Not just in Cali. So wherever you're at, Matt and his team can definitely be a resource for you, and we really appreciate all the information.
It's nice to get to learn more about eXp. Thanks for the questions and spending time with me.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Have a good one, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.